Let's ground us in the Bible here, which is where I'm always coming from with it. This is our grounding passage for tonight. It's Genesis chapter 17. Let's start in verse 18. Yeah, start in verse 18. Genesis chapter 17, verse 18. It says this. So Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael were acceptable to you. If only Ishmael were acceptable to you, God. But God said, no. Your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. I will confirm my covenant with him as a permanent covenant for his future offspring, for Isaac's future offspring. And that is my prayer for all of my Muslim friends always, is that being of Ishmael, that God would find them acceptable. And I know that acceptance we find in Jesus Christ alone. And so that is my prayer always for all of my Muslim friends. I firmly believe that everything I'm about to say is grounded in this exact hope. It's grounded in the hope that anybody, no matter who you are, can be seen as acceptable in the eyes of a holy God because of what Jesus has already done. That is my only hope, and that is the hope that grounds this exact conversation tonight. And knowing that means that even Muslims themselves can know the full power of Jesus Christ. That is what I want. So yeah, what I'm gonna do, we're gonna talk through this in three different lenses, and I'm gonna brief, and then I'm gonna actually open up for question and responses. Question and responses, and everybody go ahead and share this with somebody you know. Please like it. Don't let any of the bots come in and do all the talking for us. Um, but make sure that you're commenting, amening. I can't hear you, but I can see the chat here, and yeah. So please liven it up and keep that going. All right, so we're going to frame this in three aspects. So first, I want to give a brief history, an unknown history of Christian and Muslim relationship. That's the first thing I want to do. Give a brief unknown history. And unknown, it's just something I feel like we don't talk about a whole lot, and you've likely never heard. Then I want to ground us in some of the major and critical differences between Islam and Christianity. Very important to consider. And what the gospel has to say about those things. And then lastly, which is going to get a little controversial here, I want to talk about what I call the Islamic problem. There are these discrepancies that I have talked about with my own friends, again, of which include an imam. I haven't really received adequate answers, so maybe you all can help me out with these here tonight. All right. So that's our three framing. Again, we're going to talk first a brief Christian history, or a Christian Muslim history of relationship. So let's start about it this way. In the year 630, did you know that Muhammad actually sent a group of troops to find refuge in Abyssinia, the year 630? So this was just a few years after Islam was founded. It was founded in the 7th century officially. And so in the year 630, Muhammad sent a troop of Muslims, fresh Muslims, to find refuge and peace and safety in Abyssinia. That is super important because it is one of the first pieces of history that we have where there is interaction between Christians and Muslims. And why is it important that they went to Abyssinia? It's because Abyssinia was a region in Northwest Africa that was under Christian rule. And so from its onset, the inception of Islam, it had to exist within a cradling of specifically Black Northwestern Christians. And so that's why, where the very silly conversation that's happened in the past that's been debunked 1,000 times that, Christianity is the white man's religion is just so insane, and that some other religion maybe is not. I think it's just such a silly conversation, but other religions have had to seek refuge in Black Christians, nations in antiquity. And that needs to be talked about more than it is, because I think the only thing we typically want to talk about with Christian Muslim relationships is the Crusades and all of these things, but we see a very amicable relationship from the start, actually. We see this very kind iteration of Christianity that's very generous and has always been to all people. And that's the onset of it. Then 15 years before then, a really important thing happened. Or 15 years after I should say, an important thing happened. So Islam came on the scene in conquest. It actually came on the scene with the sword, conquering places. And the second Islamic state that it created was Mecca. Again, I'm giving you some historical facts here. Mecca. And when it conquered Mecca, when Muhammad conquered Mecca, he did something very interesting. He casted out all of the idols and crafted images, except for one thing. He didn't tear down a statue of Jesus and Mary. And why is that? You see in its inception as well, from the opposite direction, there was always this unique appreciation for Christianity within Islam. There was always this this influence that existed. There was always this admiration for Jesus Christ, even from Muhammad, the prophet in Islam himself, and that needs to be talked about. I think this is all because in the Quran, Surah 17:3 tells us that Islam sees itself as like a continuation of Christianity. It actually sees itself as a descendant of Israel. It sees itself in its inception as like a continuation of the monotheism of Jewish and Christian faith. And so because of that, Islam was originally presented as this continuation of the story of the people of Israel, and that is super important because it presents itself as being almost like the the New Testament almost. Now, of course, just to be clear, as Christians, we do not see it as a continuation, but rather a distortion of the Gospels. But the Quran itself, and again, Blender, you can show me where I'm wrong, but the Surah itself talks about how it talks about what the holy books are, and it includes the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible, the Quran itself. And again, I bring all this up because I know what the history is typically told. The typical history is told about all the evil things, the Crusades, the wars, the violence, the things that have existed. But I think what we don't talk about, and what I'm not trying to do is draw deep parallels to say that these are the same religions at all. So please hear me on that. But what I am just saying is that from its onset, kind of just Christianity has been very kind. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it was Islam that showed up with the sword. Okay, so that's a little bit about some of the hidden history of the relationship between Christians and Muslims. And again, that is important because then it frames this conversation. Now, obviously I am a pastor and I am an ordained minister. I'm unapologetic that the Bible is the truth, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and Him only. And I think there are a lot of really harsh things that could be said in either direction, right? That have been said. And so what I'm trying to do is approach this conversation first and foremost from the standpoint of showing the love of Jesus Christ so that we can get to the real truth of Jesus Christ. Because what I have found is that if we're going to help people understand God in his fullness, then it's much better to do so with grace and truth. Okay. So moving on, point two. All right, let's try to get through this. Where we at on time? Okay, we're doing good. All right. So next is again this idea that there are a lot of differences, right? So I think it goes without saying, but sometimes it doesn't go without saying. Sometimes I hear this a lot. Hey, aren't these just two different ways to the same God? That's a fun question, and the short answer is no. And the reason why I say that is there are some fundamental differences within Christianity and Islam that make them irreconcilable. They are not compatible ideologies. They are two completely different worldviews. And what I mean by a worldview is a view, an ideology through which you can base the entirety of how you view all of earth and life. That's a worldview. Like atheism is not a worldview because you can't use it as a basis through which you view everything, all things. But Christianity is a worldview. Islam is a worldview. You can look at its sacred texts and form an entire view of all the entirety of life based off of it. But they disagree with each other. They're worldviews that vehemently disagree. I won't read them for you because I'm only committed to reading the Bible here tonight, unless I get a question where I have to. But I think the biggest thing is let's start off with a couple of different facets. So the first one where there's difference is what Christians would call legalism. So in Surah 17:9, and again, toward the end, you can drop any questions in the chat, and I'll be happy to try to respond to some of those. Surah 17:9 talks to us about that there are works and deeds of righteousness that will yield a magnificent reward. That is what the Quran teaches in its basis, in its essence, and Christianity would call that legalism or works-based righteousness. That is the literally antithesis to the gospel, right? And so there's this idea that if you uphold to what Islam calls the pillars, praying the prayer, the shahada, um, praying 5 times a day, alms giving, making the pilgrimage to Mecca, these different things, fasting, these pillars of Islam. If you adhere to all of them and adhere to them well, then God might have some mercy on you because of your works and your deeds. And that, again, is literally the antithesis of Christianity. I would also say the Islam carries what would be considered by the Bible the spirit of the Antichrist. And let me show you what I mean by that. So First John 4, see if I can get to it quick. First John chapter 4, I think it's verse 3, right? It says, every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is a big hang up, so I do want to be careful. If you are Muslim, don't click away. I know that this is jarring to you all, and this is one of the biggest things that you hate about the Christian doctrine, but I believe it is true. And let me get to my points. All right, don't leave. So what the Antichrist spirit in the Bible is, again, 1 John 4:3, but every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming. Even now it is already in the world. Again, I'm trying to show you that when you say that Jesus is not the Christ, that is the antithesis of what Christians say the entirety of the Bible and life is about. And in Surah 5:73-75, I have it as a reference. It literally says Christ was just an apostle. There is no Trinity. It says these things explicitly. And then other places, Surah 17:11, it says, Allah begets no son and has no partner. This is what the Quran says. In its essence, it is operating with an ideology, a worldview that is based on what Christians would call the spirit of the Antichrist. You cannot say that these ideas are compatible at all. Again, every spirit that does not confess Jesus is God, right? That is as clear as day. So again, I don't need to read I have a bunch of other verses and passages for you, but that is just a clear, direct affront to each other's ideologies, right? Like that, both of those things are central to what each believes about God, believes God to be. And I would say even in my isolated experience, my friends who are Muslims are entrenched in this belief. I used to live in Harlem and actually visited the masjid on my block because some of my neighbors and friends went to that mosque. And, I visited with them and hung out, after one of their prayer sessions and things like that. Of course, I could not participate in their worship. We do worship different gods. But I could participate in fellowship and breaking bread. And I remember over and over, they kept asking me this question, which I did not show up to debate, by the way. Over and over, they kept asking me this question. Do you really think God can die? Do you really think he can die? Trying to prove that Jesus is not God. And I think it's a good question, but it's not the best question because I think the obvious answer is yes. Christians would say yeah to that question, and then Muslims would obviously say no. So it doesn't really help us get anywhere. I think a better question to ask, and here's a question you can write down if you are a Christian who's trying to engage your Muslim friends and neighbors. I think the better question is, how does a holy God display mercy? Because what you will find in the Bible is a God who is merciful. And what you will find in the Quran is the belief that there is a God who is merciful. Okay, but what do we mean by mercy, and how is that mercy administered? I think is a much better question to ask. It's a much better question to ask. Because here's the thing, if God is grand and God is big and God is holy and God is good and God is perfect and God is merciful, then how would that God show that mercy? Would he show it by making you fulfill a bunch of things and then maybe giving you some mercy? Or would he do it by one of the grandest, greatest, biggest, most holy acts possible? And I think that leads us in a different direction when we can start to talk about, okay, what are the attributes of God and how do we actually get to them? How do we make sense of them? I think the other thing along this line, again, Muslims are vehemently opposed to the idea that Jesus is God, and I typically wouldn't start there, even though obviously I did tonight in an actual conversation because it makes it really difficult to go on to other conversations. I think that's where you want to end, but that's not where you should start typically. Um, and again, so a lot of times Christians don't realize, some of our Muslim friends go to mosques where there are like different wisdom, they call them wisdom groups. And that wisdom group is typically sharing a bunch of not only like wisdom from the hadith and wisdom from the Quran, like the text that Muslims follow, they're also really trying to understand Christianity. So whereas like this is probably most of my Christian friends who are on here, this is probably your first time ever engaging with like Muslim thoughts for real. And that's not the typical experience of someone who regularly goes to a mosque and is deeply involved in the community there. They're typically like they're being taught things about the Bible. And so typically what you're going to experience is someone who believes that they understand what you understand. But what I have found is when they're trying to attack these types of points like this, they're typically going to bring, and I can give an example later if you need it, but they're typically going to take a verse in my isolated experience, and I have a lot of experience with this, typically take a verse and pick it up and then hold it up to say like, hey, see, this means Jesus is not God. He said it himself. And really, typically, all you need to do, I'm just showing you a framework and an exercise. All you need to do is widen that verse to it, the entire chapter that it's in. And typically, that idea completely falls apart. I'm feeling like I should show an example, but I don't have time, so I'm gonna move on. You can ask if you want. Okay, the last thing is probably the most important again, and this is where I really need you to pay attention right here. Um, what I have found, and one of the biggest things I do want my Muslim friends who I do love to understand most clearly is that Christian thought welcomes critique and Islamic thought typically does not. And there's a clear reason why. And that reason is this, and I'm going to show you some specific examples of what I mean. That reason is this. Christians often make the mistake of thinking that the Quran is like the Bible. And it's not. Not only is it completely not like the Bible, like the only thing that's probably similar in the Bible is the wisdom books like Proverbs. It's like a lot of short, piety statements. It's not like a narrative. It's just these ideas, these recitations that they believe Muhammad was given from God, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And because of that, sometimes we fail to understand how like, oh, they're not even able to critique in the same way because it would be seen as blasphemy. And here's what I mean, right? Like to say things about Jesus as a Christian, to be like, wait, was Jesus really like this? Was he really holy? Did he really do those miracles? Did he really, like you start to teeter the line of blasphemy and heresy when you ask those types of questions. And it can feel dangerous for some Christians, right? Like our community at Eden tends to be a community that's comfortable asking difficult questions. But when you start to ask really deep questions like that, sometimes you get in a place where it's like, ooh, this is feeling a little blasphemous. And that's the same thing with the Quran. And so, whereas with us, with the Bible, it's a holy text, we do believe that the written word of God is holy. But it's a different level where like to then come to the Quran and inspect it and examine it can be like you're teetering the line of blasphemy because the Quran is seen as eternal in and of itself and holy in and of itself. The Quran is like Jesus to the average Muslim. Again, I'm painting a wide blanket here, but to typical Sunni Muslim, that is how it's seen. And that's problematic because, again, what I'm going to get into is some discrepancies in Islamic ideologies that are difficult to get to the bottom of because once you start to press in, it's like, wait, blasphemy. And it's like, you wouldn't do that with the Bible because we texts criticize the Bible all the time. There's literally schools all across the United States that practice textual criticism on the Bible. But Muslims typically don't allow the same thing at the same level. And for that reason, I'm gonna give you just a few. There are way more than this, but these are some critical questions that I've asked imams, that I've asked friends of mine. But maybe you can help me consider these a little bit deeper. Right. So the first thing, there is this thought, and again, I'm gonna show you these discrepancies in Islamic thought that are problematic. And let me not say problematic. Maybe they're difficult to maintain. Let's say that. So thought number one is this: the Quran is eternal. Okay, so there's this thought that the Quran is eternal. What Muslims typically mean by that is that the Quran was given to Muhammad, but it was literally recited by God to him from heaven, because the Quran is in heaven and it has been in heaven for eternity with God, which one kind of starts to sound like a trinity, but that's another point. Right? The Quran is eternal along with God, and it is holy like him. This is problematic because Arabic is the original language of the Quran, but Arabic has an inception. We can trace through history when the Arabic language was literally created by humans in the 5th century. There are artists and poets who helped this language really form and come to be, and this whole culture that it was birthed in. And we have it in recorded history where men and women created Arabic, the language. So, how is it that anything Arabic could be eternal? It's a very difficult thing to maintain, is all I'm saying. It's a very difficult idea to maintain, given that we can trace the beginning of Arabic in history. Okay, the second thing is the Quran is without change or error. This is another idea that is central to Islamic belief and roots people deeply in that faith. And you run into issues with this as well because you don't really have, in the short of it is, you don't have a way of saying if the Quran was ever without change or error. I'm not saying that I can't prove to you that it was, even though I'm about to show you some evidence that would suggest that it's possible. But you cannot confidently assert that it is without change or error because we don't have the textual evidence to support that idea. And here's what I mean. So, for instance, and I can show you a photo, but the Quran, the most original manuscripts of the Quran that we have are written on a material called palimpsest. Palimpsest. And that's important because none of the original scripts we have of the Bible, or scrolls we have of the Bible, were written on this. And that's important because palimpsest, in its essence, was a type of material that was made to be written on, erased, and written again. That was the whole purpose of palimpsest. So that would insinuate that it has change and error. On top of that, those original manuscripts, we have a lot of them, and you can physically see Arabic characters that were erased. And so it just makes it really difficult to say that it's without change or error if we have manuscripts where we literally can physically see changes and errors that was written on a scroll and on a document, on material, with the intent to be able to make changes. That just is super problematic. The other thing is the very beginning history of the caliphs. So it would kind of almost be, I know it's not a direct equivalent, but it would almost be like the Pope of Islam is called a caliph. And the first few caliphs, just there was a lot of turmoil. So like Muhammad passed away, and then there was a caliph, I believe Abu Bakr was appointed second, first caliph, however you want to look at that, the caliph of Islam. He passed away 2 years after the fever. Then there was another another caliph appointed, and he only lasted 10 years. And there was another one, and that fourth caliph, Umar. So this was probably like the first 30 years of history of Islam after Muhammad. Not a long time. And this is problematic because there was a controversy that happened surrounding changes in the Quran. And what happened is sorry, Uthman, not Umar. Uthman, the fourth caliph, then took all of the versions, variations. We have this in history, and it even says it in the Hadith. We it took all the variations of the Quran except the one he wanted and burned them all. So, one, again, we see that there were variations in the Quran in history. All right. We first see that. And then on top of that, that might sound like unity, but that actually is extremely problematic because what that does is it takes away the ability to ever get back to the original, the true original. We don't have the copies that existed around the same time of each other to be able to compare them. Whereas with the Bible, you can see all of these different variations, different manuscripts. We pull up manuscripts every day and we criticize them and we throw them to the academy, and people who really understand language at a high level are always evaluating these things to determine what's original and what's not. And in Islam, that does not exist. Um, there are more things I could say, but I've gone past the 30 minutes I wanted to give to this. All I want you to take from this is this. I think that one, we need to be engaging with our friends and neighbors a little bit more deeply. I have a lot of friends and neighbors, people I work near that are Jewish, that are Muslim, that are all these different things, all these different ideologies. I think we just need to be unafraid to engage with people in truth and in love. That's my big thing. I think that there is a lot out there to be explored that can help our friends come to the power of Jesus Christ truly, and that's just where I'm at with it. Questions. Let me open it up. Questions. I'm gonna go through the chat to see if there are a lot of chats in here. That's what I'm talking about. Let me take a break here. Eden Joe says early church tradition agrees it is John. What are y'all talking about in here? The author of John in the Bible is anonymous. Wow. Do you got something? What is that conversation? Which one?
First one.
So this one says, sorry, thank you. Thank you, Joseph. It says, but don't Christian Arabs refer to God as Allah? Christy Hulas 888 says, while I agree the religions are different, I'm careful about saying they believe in a different God. So that is a good question. It's really just a question of language, but you have to consider the context and culture in which that question is being asked, right? So just because Arabs refer to God as Allah doesn't mean they're talking about the same God. In fact, Arabs who are in cultures and contexts and even born in cultures and contexts in which people would typically say God, they intentionally say Allah because they want to infer that they mean the God of the Quran, the God of Muhammad, not the other gods that other people are talking about. So it's really a euphemism to just allow people to appear the same, but it's not. You are talking about language, and you're right. Allah literally does just mean God in a different language. But again, when you put that in context, it is intentionally used to mean the God of Muhammad, typically. So yeah, they are talking about different gods, and that is with a purpose. So that's a good question, though. For sure. And then was that the same question, Joseph? It said, isn't that the same with any language? I'm assuming that was the same thing. Okay. Yahweh, amen. Word. Other questions? I'm feeling questions. I see a few people still joining. We've talked a lot about Christian and Muslim polemics and their differences. You're speaking of Shia Muslims. No, I am not. Nope, they are not true representatives. I'm not speaking of Shia Muslims. I'm talking about Sunni Muslims. That's not true. And even if I were, let's actually talk about that, Blender TV. Who gets to decide what is true Islam? So I'm assuming that you are a Sunni Muslim, or at least an accommodator of Sunni Islam. Who gets to determine what's true Islam? I know that the split between Sunni and Shiite Muslims happened very early on, again within those first few caliphs, because of a disagreement about how one of the caliphs might have been unappointed and reappointed. And that happened within the first 30 years after Muhammad. I would venture to say that even though it's a much smaller, even though Shiite Muslims are a much smaller percentage of Islam, I don't think it's completely fair historically just to root them out as illegitimate when they have a legitimate and technically historically orthodox view, which is why that's typically seen as the two major branches of Islam, of which there are way more than two, by the way. I don't think it's fair to just say that, even though that's not the argument I was making, but we can talk about that. Even if I was talking about Shia Muslims and Shiite Muslims, would that matter? They formed their beliefs within the first century of Islam. So they can technically be traced as historically orthodox, even though it's a much smaller sect. So I'm not really sure what you're getting at there, even if I were. But again, I wasn't. Everything I talked about just now was from Sunni Islam because I know it's a lot more popular, or more common, rather. Let me not say popular. These are good questions. Let me pull up. All right, so let's see what else we got then. I can talk about, why are we just focusing on Islam? Wouldn't this also apply to Judaism, Robert says, Buddhism, or any other religions? Robert, that is an excellent question, and I love that question, truly. I don't say that facetiously. So at the beginning of this talk, I'd encourage you to scroll back toward the beginning. I actually addressed this for this reason. I think this is a popular thought right now in Islam. And I know that again because I have Muslim friends, but it's very popular to say that Christians feel super comfortable critiquing Islam and not other religions. Why don't you critique Judaism? That's a fair critique, but not on this channel, because you can scroll back to 2 lives ago where I did talk about Judaism. So I encourage you to listen to the beginning of this talk, listen to the whole thing, and then you can go listen to that too. But it is a fair critique, just not in this space. We have done that. But tonight we are talking about Islam because Eid al-Fitr is happening tomorrow. And yeah, Eid al-Fitr is happening tomorrow. And so, yeah, it's a great time to talk about it. I see another question. Also, forgive me if I read your question and I don't want to answer it. I'm not saying that about this one, but I just needed to get that out. Jax Sant 17 says, what ways do you suggest we talk to family and friends who are Muslims? I think one of the biggest things is uh, engaging and evangelizing Muslims. In my isolated experience, again, of which I have much in this realm, you do need to approach it a bit differently because Islam is just a different religion, man. And I think that there needs to be a balance of like knowing truly where they're coming from on things and how they view your views. Otherwise, you just won't be effective, right? I'm not talking about bending the Bible. I'm not talking about bending truth. I'm not talking about letting go of biblical convictions. But we do need to, I've noticed Christians need to do a little bit more work than we have to understand other people's thoughts so that we can help them see what we believe is the truth. Other people try to do it to us. You know what I mean? Like, in one thing I didn't talk about in Christian Muslim relationships is that a lot of times Muslims have a very high view of Christians because they think they're easy to convert because they don't study Islam at all. They don't know anything about it. And so when they're typically hearing it from a friend or family member, they're hearing about ideas for the first time ever that sound really convincing until you explore some of the things that we talked about just a few minutes ago and realize there's some deep ideological, not even just theological issues. There are deep, I didn't even get to theology. There's so many theological issues. But what I've found is that typically you are entrenched in like a theological ideology already, and it's difficult to just go straight to that. I still am answering your question, trust me, I'm going somewhere. It's difficult to just go straight to like, here's your theology, here's why I think it's problematic, and here's my theology, I think it's better. It's typically, you're right, I think, but it's ineffective. I think it's a lot more helpful to begin to unravel things from an ideological perspective like we did today, because again, a lot of times you're talking to someone who might be a part of a wisdom group who has already been so entrenched in this idea like, no, Jesus is not God. And I have all these reasons to prove, I have 1,000 like ideas in my head as to why I believe that's true already. And so to work through all of that is just not, it's not as effective as attacking it from, not attacking it, of approaching it from the lens that I don't think they're typically thinking of it through. To think of it through the lens of, hey, I know it is like taboo to critique the Quran in your space that you're typically in, but I'm not afraid to critique the Quran. And I see how saying the Quran is eternal is problematic when Arabic has a historical starting point. How are both of those true? These are the types of things that I don't, in my experience, believe that Muslims have thought through a lot of times. And I think it can be a lot more helpful to think through it. Again, from an ideological perspective first, so that you can get to what you believe to be true. Anyway, I think it needs to be approached with grace, with love, but with bold truth. I think we just need to do a little bit more work to help them and unravel some of the things they already think. So I hope that's helpful. We did that question already. Athens inviting people to church. You already know. Pastor B, can we, Yanexis Quintana 2588 says, Pastor B, can we address the thoughts shared here on God can't die? God didn't die. So I did talk about that briefly, but yeah, we can circle back to that. So that goes back to my talking point about like, I think it's a very common thing that roots the idea that that Jesus is not God. That's all they're trying to prove. That's what I was getting at. Like I brushed on that because really all that is an idea that undergirds something they already believe that they're trying to prove, in that Jesus is not God, which again, I already showed you the reason why they believe that is because of the surahs that I quoted earlier. So the problem is not actually God can't die. Even though to them that is like not almost, it's a blasphemous claim to say like God can die. And again, the reason why I brushed past it is because I know that argument very well, and I know that starting there is not effective because it typically, and again, I didn't even see it in the chat, but it sounds like it's been blasted in the chat. That is a typical mosque wisdom group touting point. God can't die. How could God die? And I did talk about that. Do you believe God can die? I think so. I'll start where I'll go back over where I started first, but then I'll give you some examples of what I mean. I typically want to get away from that question because there's an obvious answer. What you're asking me is, do I think God can die? How can God die? Okay, the Bible explains it. So, like, I don't even need to explain it to you. You already know I believe God died on the cross and he rose from the dead. That's what I believe, to defeat death and sin for you who would believe in Jesus Christ. That's the gospel. And I already know that Muslims believe that he can't. So it's not a helpful question to like dive super deep into. I can see the surahs that tell you God can't die. You can see the verses that tell us God died and rose from the dead. So like, what are we even talking about? I think the better question to ask, because what we're talking about is mercy. When we're talking about the aspect of Jesus dying on the cross and raising from the dead, what we're talking about is a holy God who has decided to dispense his mercy on the world. That's what we're actually talking about. And I think that is a conversation we can have as a Christian and as a Muslim. I believe as a Christian in mercy, in the mercy of God. And as a Muslim, you also believe in the mercy of God. Okay, so if we both believe that there is a God in heaven who's perfect and holy and dispenses his mercy on people who he loves, then how would that perfect and holy God dispense mercy? Would it be the Muslim idea that says God dispenses mercy because of my works and my deeds? So I earn his mercy somehow, even though I'm not perfect in upholding the law. I'm imperfect, but somehow a perfect God is going to dispense his mercy to me. And he's a great, grand God, but he needs me and my works to dispense it, or else he can't. Seems like a really small God to me. Or would he do something way more grand to show how perfect and holy and big and powerful he is in dispensing his mercy? That, like maybe going all the way to the extent of humbling himself and dying on a cross and being buried and raising from the dead, that there would be a God who goes to that extent for the people that he loves to keep the promises that he made. That is what we're talking about.